So thank you very much, Peter. Over to you.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. You're going to hear some Connecticut accent mixed with a little bit of New York accent, so I apologize in advance, but it's what I've got to work with. As Harold indicated, I moved to this area of Connecticut about 3.5 years ago, and I was looking for something to do, and my sister had come up, and my daughter and a friend as well, and my then fiance, who is now my wife. And I said, okay, well, there's got to be something to do in this town. It's a nice day, we should go for a walk. So I found this little river called the Scantic River, and it was a nice walk along it. And on the way out of the park, there was a little kiosk, and on the kiosk were a couple of sheets of 8.5/11 paper, and written on one was maybe 3 or 4 lines, and it basically said that in 1835, a Connecticut or Yankee peddler had purchased 500 acres and had constructed a gunpowder mill there, which had subsequently exploded in 1913. So on the way back to the car, I was thinking to myself, well, where does a Yankee peddler get enough money to buy 500 acres? And why in God's name would he consider constructing a gunpowder mill of all things? Because for those of you who may know, the northeast of the U.S. is rather risk adverse, and kind of it's counterintuitive that one would build a gunpowder manufactory. So the next slide here has an embedded video, and it gives a quick overview of what the book itself is about. And then I'm going to get into really the Faversham connection and how that factors in with the gunpowder mill here in Connecticut.
Over 100 years ago, on the banks of the Scantic River, there stood one of the most successful gunpowder mills in the United States. Founded in 1835 by the Loomis brothers and Allen Andrews Denslow, and built on 500 acres of land purchased from the widow of Dr. David Allen, the powder mill enjoyed early financial successes. After the sale of the manufactories to Augustus George Hazard of the Rhode Island Hazards and a group of wealthy financial backers from Brooklyn, New York, the facilities expanded, challenging the DuPonts of Delaware for supremacy in the explosives industry. The company, employees, and towns of Enfield, Hazardville, and Skidico prospered based on the economic impact of the Hazard powder site. When company president and Enfield resident Hazard died in 1868 in a New York City hotel after a long struggle with smallpox and pleuropneumonia, the company was purchased by their former competitor, DuPont, and continued as a successful venture. But in the 1890s, the mill had begun to show its age, with explosions and deaths occurring with more frequency. The early 1900s saw the mill suspend operations 3 times, only to restart after prolonged shutdowns. During that same period, DuPont lost 2 lawsuits in Connecticut courts, one against the town of Enfield in a land valuation challenge, and another, a water rights issue against the upstream Somerville Manufacturing Company. By late 1912, the towns of Enfield, Hazardville, and Skidico had matured and had grown tired of the economic seesaw that was Hazard powder. Likewise, DuPont, who had suffered both regional and national legal losses associated with Hazard powder, had become tired of the economic albatross. And then, on January 14th, 1913, at 1:30 in the afternoon, all hell broke loose at the site along the Scantic River.
So with this part of the tale, and I'm only going to focus on the parts where it makes sense for this discussion. We begin in 1810, and the reason to begin there and with this topic will kind of self-expose. So in 1810, in the area of Suffield and East Windsor in Connecticut, which is a tobacco growing region. The brothers Simon and Roswell Viets hired a Cuban national to introduce the idea of and concept and actual rolling of Principe Spanish cigars into the region. And in fact, this was really the first cigar manufacturing site within the United States. And basically what he did was employ all of the farmhouse wives to roll the cigars. And a Principe is a cigar, if you know, has kind of twisted ends on both ends of the cigar. The Loomis brothers were Yankee peddlers. They would find any article to resell up and down the northeast coast of the U.S. and as far west as the middle of the country out in Ohio. So in 1815, the Loomis brothers get involved in peddling Viets' cigars around the region and introducing those into areas, and business is quite brisk. The Loomis brothers are they're very sharp businessmen, and when they see an opportunity, they try to control it as best as possible. So in 1821, about 6 years later, they forced the Viets out of the cigar manufacturing business and take it over. And their idea is to cut out the middleman wherever possible, so they're first in line for all profits. Now, one of the interesting things they do is they travel from Connecticut, almost on the border of Massachusetts, down to New York City, the port of New York City, to meet the tobacco ships coming in from Cuba. And for specific types of tobacco, they purchase the entire boat. And they bring so they corner the market in that type of tobacco, so much so that other interests from around the country have to travel all the way to this little corner of Connecticut to purchase this highly valued brand of tobacco. So again, they're pretty brilliant businessmen. And the Loomis name is going to come up again, so I'll talk about that a bit later. In around 1802, in Kingston, Rhode Island, Augustus George Hazard is born. And to give you an idea, the Hazard family were one of the first inhabitants of Rhode Island itself, which is on the east coast of the U.S. And it was also a very, one of the major slave trading ports in the U.S. at the time. They had horses that they bred there that were specific to that area of the country and really of the world, called Pacers. I'm trying to remember what the name, but not Rhode Island Pacers, but it might come to me later on, but it's certainly covered in the book. And there's also plantations really out on that in that state that were really kind of reflective of the same types of cotton plantations down in the south of the country. But it's interesting that Gus's Hazard's line or lineage of the family falls on hard times. And one of the reasons is that one of his predecessors aligns himself with the British during the Revolutionary War. And neighbors didn't take kindly to that, and certainly and took away his land and money. So they basically had nothing, and they weren't really helped much by other relatives. So in 1810, his line of the family moved to Connecticut, and he takes up painting as an apprentice at the time, and his line is can't go any lower. So he has it in his mind to try to bring his line of the Hazards back up to the same level as his relatives in Rhode Island. So he spends a few years learning the trade, and then in 1820, I believe it's 1820, in Savannah, Georgia, the entire marketing district is burnt out to the ground. There may have been one, maybe two companies left in that area of the city, but the city is left without any marketing or merchandising vehicles. So the call goes out to the country to say, if you have money, because at that point the country was in a difficult financial state, and so was the city, and they had no money to offer anyone to help them relocate or start a business. The call goes out to anyone with an interest to locate there and to begin businesses to help foment kind of a resurrection of that part of the city. So Augustus Hazard, with his paints and varnishes in hand, heads south. Along the way somewhere, and it's kind of unclear as to how, he associates himself with an Alan Andrews Denslow of New Haven, Connecticut, who is a marketer himself, again, in that part of Connecticut, because there's a deep water port there, and they're able to take in goods, and he can then turn and sell those goods to either local individuals or ship them out to other areas of the state. So Alan Andrews Denslow meets Hazard in the South, and they open up a painting, varnishes, whale oil, whatever you might need store, and it takes off. It does very well, because when you're resurrecting a city, one of the things you certainly need is paint. In 1827, based on the success of the Savannah store, he moves to New York City, Lower Manhattan, and establishes another paint store that basically mimics the one that he has in the South. But his real idea is to build or establish a mercantile business in New York City, so that he can ship goods from the South to the North, and goods from the North to the South, to establish that type of a packet ship experience. And he even does so with England, bringing goods over from the UK to the US. And I suppose some trade would have taken place as well from the US back to the UK. But the mercantile business does well. He, among everything else, he markets Loomis cigars and gunpowder. And the gunpowder, again, comes from the Loomis brothers, who are fronting it for a number of different large facilities or manufacturing sites in, or smaller sites, I'm sorry, in Connecticut, but also one large site in Lee, Massachusetts, which is about halfway up the Mass state on the left-hand side, a large gunpowder manufacturing concern. Unfortunately, in 1828, it blows up. About 40 tons or 20 tons, but I'm thinking it's 40 tons of powder go off at one time, and it takes out all of the manufacturing buildings and an awful lot of the neighborhood houses and homes, and the impact prompts the town to turn to the the owners, who were Laughlin and another Loomis, and say, you can't do this anymore. So they shut the site down and they sell the property, and someone picks up the property and puts in a paper manufacturing mill, because it's right on a good river that's got sufficient water flow to drive machinery. So with the loss of the Lee mill, Loomis and Hazard combined forces, and they purchased 3 local powder mills in Connecticut to help replace the powder that was lost in the Lee, Massachusetts explosion. But it's just not enough, because demand increases and supply is limited. So Denslow, who was Hazard's partner in Savannah, Hazard introduces Denslow to the Loomis brothers, and they purchased the 500 acres, a little less than that actually, in Enfield, and begin to construct a gunpowder mill. Let me just make sure I'm here. Yeah, okay. So the gunpowder mill begins to produce powder, but it's of suspect quality. So now we'll talk about the Prickett boys, and they're over in your country. And in 1816, the 6 sons, Henry, Bennett, George, James, Jesse, and William, moved from, now I may not say these town names correctly, so I'm happy for someone to correct me, but my best is Alcombe and Faversham. So they move from Alcombe to Faversham, and they begin to be employed in the powder trade. Now the question is, how old were they when they took jobs then? I'm not sure what the requirements or regulations were, if there were any at the time, but they were probably anywhere from 16 to 22 years old. And that's around 1828, 1826 or so. By 8 to 10 years later, the Pricketts are recognized as powder experts in their craft, if not all of them, most of them anyway. And I'm not sure they were all employed in the same by the same mill either. As I recall, there's at least 3 or 4. I think they were in the Faversham area. So we talk a little bit about A. Denslow, or Alan Andrews Denslow. And he, of course, is at the Enfield site. He purchased the site with the Loomis brothers. The single brass ball mill is running, and again, the competency of the workers, the quality of the gunpowder is suspect at best, or certainly substandard. So in 1836, Denslow hops on a boat and heads from New York to Faversham to basically steal some of your workers. I put in here offer employment, but basically that's what they were doing. They're looking to upgrade their powder quality by kind of fast tracking the ability to enhance the quality by bringing in experienced powder workers. So William Prickett and his family, they accept the offer of employment, and they move to America in April, and then his brother Henry and his wife follow in May of that same year. So in 1836, they're on a boat headed to New York, and then from New York to Enfield, Connecticut. And the impact on the quality of the gunpowder is almost immediate. So much so that it quickly becomes, in quality alone, competitive with the powders being produced by DuPont down in Wilmington, Delaware. So now Enfield has a taste of Faversham's best. So this time, William Prickett hops on a boat, heads to Faversham, and he returns with 9 powder men and their families. And that includes all of his brothers, Bennett, George, James, and Jesse. And additionally, I don't have the names of the other powder workers, but they all are offered a single, 1-year contracts. That's all they need to commit to. And the idea, of course, is to bring in the experts to train new employees in powder production so that they can maintain the quality even if the other English powdermen decide to end their employment after a year. One does. I don't know if I have the next line here. No, it's another screen. But we'll talk a little bit about longevity or impact, really, of the Pricketts on the powder itself. Being a qualified and competent powder worker doesn't mean that you're immune to the possibilities of the trade. So in 1838, Henry Prickett severely burned in an accident in the Enfield mill, but instead of retiring from the business, he chooses to move to a competing mill that's located in upstate New York. William and George, after their first year, they choose to remain at the site in Enfield. And 2 years later, their brother Jesse, who had again moved to a powder mill in upstate New York, dies in an explosion in 1840. 2 years later, in 1842, George Prickett is badly burned in an Enfield wheel mill explosion, and after suffering for about 12 hours, dies, probably thankfully, succumbing to his burns. Brother Bennett moves to Ohio. He chooses to exit the powder making business, and possibly it's a best decision he may have made of the Prickett brothers. And then lastly, William in 1844, he is involved in a rolling mill explosion, and this is the only reading I'm going to have from the book itself, but it's from chapter 7. The chapter is entitled Brass Balls. Wednesday, the 16th of October, was a cool day with air blowing in from Canada on a northwest wind. The leaves on the trees, those that were left, were various shades of red, orange, and brown, and fluttered in response to the gentle nudge from the north, maintaining their tenuous hold on to the trees that had birthed them only 6 months earlier. Nelson McClester had been contracted by Allen Denslow to make some repairs at the rolling mill where Gilbert Durfee and William Prickett were working, transferring ground powder to carts to be moved to the press mill. A dust explosion, also known as a fuel-air explosion, is defined by the rapid combustion of fine particles suspended in the air within an enclosed location, and are frequently associated with coal mines and grain elevators. Thermobaric weapons, the most powerful non-nuclear weapons in the world, use this same principle. The sudden release of energy from a detonation produces a massive shock wave. There are 5 requirements for a thermobaric explosion. A combustible dust exists. The dust is suspended in the air at a high concentration. There is an oxidant or oxygen. There's an ignition source, and the area is confined. As Prickett and Durfee used wooden shovels to load the transfer cart with powder that had been mixing since that morning, McClester turned to the men and noted how the air seemed to shimmer as the morning sun broke through the trees and in through the doorway. He swung his hatchet to cleave the end of an oaken beam to complete a wooden joint he had been constructing for repairs, when the blade glanced off the hardwood at an angle, striking the teeth of a metallic gear driving the pulverizing machinery. The sharp click of metal against metal might have been the last sound Durfee and McClester heard before the resulting spark ignited the air around them, and then the 600 pounds of gunpowder in the mill. Miraculously, Prickett survived, but just like his brother George, William was badly burned. His entire body cleared of hair, skin crisped to the touch, slipping from his body when he was carried like charred skin off a cooked ham. William was transported in the back of a wagon to the little yellow house on the farm he and his brother Henry had purchased only years earlier. For hours, William Prickett slipped in and out of consciousness, his blackened skin crackling as he struggled to breathe, the lining of his throat and esophagus charred from inhaling scalding air. His normal inflammatory response system was on overdrive as his body slipped into shock. The fluids left inside led to a general swelling of his body, causing further ruptures in his compromised skin. Mercifully, after 3 days, he died. The first wave of the Prickett powdermen of Faversham came to a merciful close. And that's the presentation I have for you that connects Enfield, the little town of Enfield, Connecticut, to your location in the UK. As you can see, your impact on the quality of the powder produced there by the Pricketts themselves, introducing concepts like drying the willow and woods that are used to be turned into charcoal in a manner that was different than had been used at that point in time, as well as moving from kind of rolling brass balls to crush or to mix the powder to rolling mills. So their techniques and knowledge were put to great effect in Enfield, and again, so much so that the quality of the powder was world renowned and made the job of selling it much easier. Of course, that also drove the demand. So the town of Enfield grew to about the site had about 125 buildings on it at its greatest height, and about 250 to 275 workers working round the clock and providing gunpowder either to sites that or countries that were at war, or to sites that were either building infrastructure or excavating mines.
Peter,
And with that, I'll leave it to your questions.
Peter, just before we have the questions, thank you very much.
Sure.
I just wanted to ask, it's in the town of Enfield. Is that where the Enfield rifle originated as well? Is there a connection there between the gunpowder and the rifle?
Well, it's kind of funny you asked that question, because Connecticut, for some reason, had quite an affinity for explosives or guns themselves. And I'm not sure whether that rifle itself originated here or designed or originated here, but there were at least 2 other rifle manufacturers in the state who produced guns, one of them being the Colt manufacturing site in Hartford, Connecticut. And so it was kind of a natural, I mean, he also had Climax Fuse, who was here. So you've got the fuse manufacturers, you've got gunpowder manufacturers, large and small, and you've got gun manufacturers. So there you have America in a nutshell.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Rod, I'm sure you've got a question. Do we know anything about the prickets?
No, I can look it up in John's archive, but no, the name doesn't spring to mind. I'll certainly look that up.
Rod, just before you go on, I can't resist just can't easily do it actually, but I discovered, I just looked quickly, and there was a Catherine Prickett, now Wildish, who lived in Faversham between 1772 and 1832, and she was the wife of a William Prickett. So it is possible that we can trace that connection.
Yeah.
But that's on it's nothing to do with gunpowder. It's just on a sort of heritage website, that particular family. But it may well be, and if we can find it, Rod, I think we should, at the very least, send the details to Peter.
Yeah, certainly.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, when I was doing some of the research for this, I was able to locate what the boats were, or the ships were, that the Pricketts traveled to the U.S. on, and that was through I think it was through Ancestry.com, where I was able to locate the actual bills for the tickets for the individuals, and who was on which ships, and when they traveled, and when they arrived, and the like, and who was with them.
It's fascinating. Rod, did you want to ask a question? Sorry to take that over, rather.
Right. Could I ask, Peter, the 1913 explosion at Enfield, do we know what caused it?
Well, you know, it's funny. There was, of all the explosions that occurred at the Enfield site, there was only 2 or 3 where they were actually able to identify what the issue was, or why it might have occurred. And you know, I'm not enough of a detective to figure it out, but there were certain parts that were reclaimed that indicated that it was most likely, and this is what I kind of identify in the book, that, you know, when they press the cake, the kind of wet powder into cakes, with the amount of pressure they have, the only thing that I could surmise, because they recovered the pressure gauge and everything seemed to be fine, the belief is that one of the cakes may have simply stuck to one of the plates, and in prying it loose, it's possible that it could have chipped or snapped, and in so doing created a spark. And that's all it took. That was my guess, was that there was a spark from cake that had kind of adhered to one of the plates. But no matter what it was, there wasn't much to do after that spark hit the dry powder. And the interesting thing was there, you know, that the last explosion in 1913 could have been a lot worse, because even though 4 buildings went up, one of the buildings that the roof was on fire had 40 tons of powder in kegs ready to be shipped out. And by luck or grace of God, they were able to put the fire out, and that never took off. But if it had, the site in the town itself of Hazardville, which is a great name in and of itself, would have would have been wiped off the map. You would have had just a nice bowl there that could have been probably turned into a lake.
Yeah. Thank you.
And as I was explaining to Harold too at the end, you know, by the end, the town was kind of tired or had outgrown the site itself. DuPont had nothing but headaches after 1900 with the site, and so in some way it was almost a blessing that the site exploded, because then the DuPont could shut it down, and there wasn't much of a fuss that was kicked up. Yeah, and the one last thing I'll throw in here too was those two individuals who died in the last explosion. They weren't really the last two to die from the effects of the powder mill itself. One, about a year later, one individual who had been on site, but his partner had taken the day off. The one who had been on site probably had PTSD, and about a year later, he hunted down his previous partner and shot him dead in the street. So we kind of ascribe that death to the mill. And then the last one was when a company was hired to basically take all of the iron and machinery and brass, etc., out of the site just to reclaim the metals. They found about 20 pounds or so, 25 pounds of dry powder underneath one of the buildings. And one individual reported to the supervisor, who said, run back there and, you know, throw water on it and throw it into the canals. But before he got there, somebody did something, and a hot ember hit down below, and the thing blew up. And there was 5 people there. 4 of them were thrown away, and one was just caught right in the middle, like a wick of a candle, just burning. And that was really the last death that was ascribed to or attributed to the mill itself.
Yeah, thank you. Just another comment on the explosions. In the 4 centuries that Faversham worked on the industry, there were surprisingly few actual gunpowder explosions, and there are about 40 incorporated mills in the Faversham area over that period. And surprisingly, there were very few explosions there. They were mainly from the corning process or the glazing one. You know, that's where most of the deaths occurred.
Really?
So, yeah.
That's actually interesting. That it would. Well, of course, I guess the powder is probably the driest at that point.
Yeah. Also, in the incorporated mill process, which lasts about 4 or 5 hours, and where the powder is sort of crushed and mixed and ground, the moisture is kept above 5%.
Yeah,
which helps. And the powder is not compressed. You know, it's in open.
Sure.
Open sort of vat, and as you know, powder rarely explodes unless it's compressed. So,
right.
So another reason there were so few accidents. The chief ones, as Harold well knows, was from our later high explosives factories, where you know, some dreadful explosions and deaths.
Right. Yeah. Well, that was, that was one of the attractions I was speaking to Harold about. It was about writing the book, is that, for any book you need a hook, you need something to be the main attraction. And certainly this was, the end explosion was one of them, but it was also the culmination, really, the natural end of the industry here. The number of explosions here, I'm also going to attribute to the fact that I don't think they were as conscious of the potential for injury. I mean, some of one of the individuals who had died, and this was when one of the competing mills, Hazard owned his own mill site, and then some of his employees put in another competing mill upstream from him. When that was basically consumed by Hazard within about 4 years or so, and they took some of the equipment downstream and others upstream. One of the companies and one of the employees of the who was cleaning up the site, basically died because he lit a cigar, while he was on break, cleaning up. And he was a day worker, probably not used to the fact. But the other thing is that one reason I mentioned tobacco is tobacco and of course alcohol were two products that were highly consumed. And some of these, which is one of the things I was trying to do, was identify whether most of these explosions occurred the day after payday or something. So you figure if you get paid on a Friday, you consume alcohol that evening, and maybe, or if they get paid on a Saturday or however it was, was there a connection between inebriation and exhumation,
Yeah.
And was there, Peter?
I couldn't find enough information on that. But quite a bit of that did occur down in the DuPont mills in Delaware. So there was more information on that down there. So I could probably safely believe that it had something to do with it. In fact, actually, in one of the explosions, two of the individuals who did die were kind of known as alcoholics and risk takers. So for that one explosion, you could probably attribute it to a little bit of the drink, if you will. The other thing to consider too is, I don't know how the managers of the mills were in your area, but Hazard himself was driven. Since his line of hazards had kind of fallen on hard times, he was driven to bring his line up to and possibly above those of his relatives in Rhode Island. So he was always taking risks and pushing other people to take risks. He wouldn't take them as own. He would take business risks, but not anything that would put himself in personal danger. But he basically, was a party to the death of his eldest son, who was supposed to be an heir to the company, because his son was out on the field proving powder. In an eprouvette, he'd done one test, and that passed, and then he did the second test, but there was still an ember in the eprouvette. He poured in the second load or second charge of powder, still had the can, and the thing exploded, took his arm off, and then basically consumed his eyes and burned his face, and he dropped to the ground and basically died that evening. So Hazard, because he was driven, he basically played a role in his own son's death, and then years later in a potential son-in-law's death, because that individual that had worked in a a competing powder mill in Delaware, and he had toyed around with dry mixing powder. In other words, not keeping it wet at all. And of course, if you put too much water in, you can wash out saltpeter, and then you don't have anything left but slush or a slurry. So he was working at dry mixing to speed up the production, but he'd basically given up on it after a few mishaps. So Hazard hires him on. He becomes a superintendent of the mill, and he pushes him to try to incorporate the dry mixing again. Well, he said, no, you really shouldn't do this, because it's just too the potential for danger. So Hazard wouldn't hear no. So of course, this individual dies and takes 3 other people with him when they're attempting to, prove the dry mixing process.
Yeah.
So, when you say you didn't have many explosions, or the number was low, we had our share. There were, I can't remember the numbers here, somewhere 30 some odd, 40 some odd explosions, and it could simply be because the individuals were pushed to produce, and in some ways pushed to produce around the clock.
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. Nigel, did you want to come in with a question? Nigel?
No, that's fine, thanks.
Is there anything anyone else wants to ask before we go back to Rod? It's worth saying, Peter, that Rod is with John Shreve, runs a gunpowder mill up on the Westbrook. Rod, do you want to pursue anything else with Peter? There's plenty of time.
Nothing that springs to mind, but certainly if we have a chance of reading Peter's book, that will be very, very interesting, informative.
Well, I think we need to get our shop to get some over and promote the book. Sally, you wanted to come in with a question. Sally Wilts? Sally, do you want to put your microphone
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm related to the Draysons of Faversham, who subsequently went to Waltham. And I just wondered, I know Henry Drayson went to the States to try and sell a patented version of making gunpowder in the States. He wasn't very successful. I know he went to Delaware, but I don't know if he had any connection with your particular mill.
The name doesn't ring a bell, but certainly if he was going to Delaware, he would have met with the DuPonts.
Yeah.
Their main facilities were. There were other competitors there along the Brandywine, but for the most part, it was DuPont. It's interesting because an awful lot of innovation, even though America or the US kind of prides itself to be innovators, in this instance, or at least certainly in this time period, all the innovation and certainly expertise was coming in from across the sea, whether it was Britain itself or whether it was France, as far as the DuPonts were concerned. Innovation wasn't really their forte here, except of course in the failed dry mixing powder event. And we really just benefited from the innovations from overseas. Even so, as I was talking to Henry earlier about the fuse, the cotton fuse that was, I think it was embedded with gunpowder and then varnished over, which really kind of was an absolute safer way to let off dynamite or any other controlled explosion. And of course that came from the Britain as well. So hats off to your country and your countrymen.
It goes to show, Peter, that there's nothing new about industrial espionage, doesn't it?
That's right. Yeah. Well, it's the shortest route is a straight line. So instead of trying to teach yourselves, just as easier to overpay the experienced and learn from them.
I was intrigued. Sorry, Rod. Let me just pursue this for a minute. I was intrigued that some guys from Faversham would travel to America on a 1-year contract.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a very short-term proposition, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, actually, what it was is kind of an escape clause. They could stay as long as they wanted to.
Oh, I see. Okay.
but they were really only being contracted to stay or committing to stay for the 1 year.
So it was
And
bonded labor in order to justify the cost.
That's right.
Okay. That makes more sense, I think.
Yeah, it's not unlike in this town here. There was one of the largest carpet manufacturing companies in the country at the time, and there was an Italian businessman here who was a bank owner, and he would pay the passage for his countrymen to move into this area, but they had to guarantee that they would keep their money in his bank. So everybody's got an angle.
Sally, did you want to ask anything else to follow up? I think probably not. Nigel?
No, thank you.
Rod, do you want to have a final comment or questions? There's no rush.
Yeah, just a quick one on the development of high explosives. Were any of the mills that you had knowledge of or researched, did they experiment with early high explosives like gun cotton?
Yeah, they did, not so much as they did in your part of the world, and I think that was based more on some of the kind of more explosive events that you had due to that manufacturing process. I think what really competed here was dynamite. Once Nobel had developed that really competed with, and so was nitroglycerin.
Yes.
Nitro, of course, being more unstable, so they gravitated to dynamite, certainly, because that was safer, if you will. And the companies that did gravitate to those new explosives like dynamite were the ones that eventually survived. Those that kind of held on to gunpowder itself are the ones that kind of were succumbed to the larger organizations, either burying them based on price fixing or by purchasing them and then doing whatever they could with the equipment that was there and then taking over their client list. Yeah. It was interesting how the industry did mature, though.
Yeah.
Go on, Rod.
Just to come back again to the development of high explosives. In one of the Faversham mills in the 1840s, they experimented with making gun cotton as an industrial process. It had been developed in Germany a few years earlier, only in the laboratory. And the Faversham mill owners bought the patent and spent about 15 years trying to turn it into an industrial process. But there was one disaster in the 1840s when the shed that they were working in, something went wrong with the process they were trying to develop, and the whole thing exploded, killing all 20 people.
Wow.
So it then took another 20 years for them to develop a safer gun cotton process. And,
I would imagine something like that could put the brakes on enthusiasm, or drive one back to the drawing board and say, well, let's have a second go at this.
That's right. Yeah. It did result, though, in the huge 3-mile long high explosives factory on the edge of Faversham, where all sorts of explosives were made, and the first one was called the gun cotton factory for that reason. So
So here's a question back to your group: is why is the Faversham area such a kind of a hotbed of gunpowder or gunpowder innovation? And what's the reason? Is it because of the willow, or because the pieces are just happen to be there, or is it because it's easy to transport out of? What was the reasoning?
The main reason, it was where the gunpowder was needed.
Oh,
Because all the way along the Thames estuary, Faversham feeds into the Thames estuary,
sure.
Were naval and military forts. I could name about 10 of them, but they won't mean anything to you. And so that's where the powder was needed. And Faversham was connected to the Thames estuary by a creek where the materials could be brought in by barge and sent out by barge to those places. And the other factors, of course, helped, like strong streams to drive the water wheels,
Sure.
and the availability to make charcoal on site. So
Right.
it was all those factors combined to make Faversham a really hotbed of gunpowder manufacture.
Did they ever move over to steam-driven machinery? I know they did here in Enfield at some point.
Yes, one of the more modern gunpowder sites in Faversham during the 1800s, they converted from water wheel driven machinery to first of all steam engines. And then in the early 20th century to electric motors to drive these mills. So
Wow.
yeah, there was a gradual process of improvement of the driving stuff.
Yeah, I would imagine that that moving from water to steam probably had its own inherent challenges and risks, and then certainly probably going to electric.
Yeah,
They have up the ante a bit.
yeah, certainly did.
Roddy, you'll talk to John, Peter, John Shreve.
Breeze, yeah.
Breeze, sorry, Breeze. Yeah, that's unfortunate. John Breeze, I'm sorry, John. John Breeze has done short biographies of 2,500 gunpowder workers. So there's a reasonable chance that the Pricketts will be in there. And
Yes,
he's quite elderly now, and I think Rod can look at the index and see what's there. And certainly we'll share with you whatever we can find on the Pricketts. It's a fascinating connection across the Atlantic.
Yeah, it's and I've spoken to the mayor here in the town and asked him if he'd be interested in having and even the folks here at the Historical Society that I'm part of here in Enfield, and seeing if there might be a way to kind of further the connection between the two sites and between the two groups, whether for education reasons or for no other than the sharing information.
Yeah, it'd be nice to do that.
Yeah, I thought it was a nice way to kind of even move beyond the book itself to make it a chance to connect across the water here. I do hope to get over there, early next year, and I'd love to swing by and either do a reading there. I'm trying to talk to one of the other sites and to do a book reading there as well. I mean, it's on my dime just because I can write it off at the same time. But I thought it'd be a nice chance to read from the book and then to talk to folks over there too. And if I get some additional information that might merit including it in a second
edition, yeah. Rod, I'm thinking you would need to be here at least 3 days, wouldn't you, to have any chance of understanding even.
I think I'd come over for a good 7.
I think, but I think you would need to be in Faversham for a significant amount of time.
Oh yeah,
yes.
There's an awful lot of the gunpowder industry still possible here to see.
Yeah.
Rod, how much time do you think it would take to do it properly?
How much time? What?
How many days ought you to allow to get a proper understanding of gunpowder?
Yeah, I think you're right. 3 days is a good estimate, because there's our lovely restored incorporated mill, which is quite famous. It's possibly the best restored mill in the whole world.
Wow.
And And then another one of the gunpowder sites has been turned into a country park, because that has a few remnants, massive remnants of Corning mills and
Wow.
and so on. So yes, it will be 2
And
to
on
3
top of that,
days,
of
I
course,
think.
there's the Stonebridge Pond, which was a big manufacturing site, and there's quite a lot of blast walls and so on out on the marsh as well from
Yeah.
a later period. So I think Peter, I'd just say make sure you're going a minimum of 3 days. Otherwise,
Right.
you're going to go away a very unhappy man. And I don't want that to be the case. So
Well, I'm sure I won't.
3 days.
Yeah, I won't want to shortchange myself. I don't know.
No, you don't. That would be a dreadful mistake.
It
But we'd
would
be very
sure.
pleased to, I'm sure Rod and John would be very pleased to show you around.
Yeah, that'd be
Yeah.
great. Yeah, I'd look forward to it.
Certainly would.
Yeah.
Well, look, Rod, can I leave it with you to check out with John Breeze what's actually in our records for the Prickets? And I'll put you directly in touch with Peter so that you can handle that correspondence. We're going to put this recording up on our website and encourage other people to look at it as well. And certainly, Peter will look at getting some of your books in stock and selling them.
That'd be great. Great. Appreciate it. Yeah.
Good,
It's been a great experience, and I hope this is just the beginning.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Right.
Yeah.
Rod, were you wanting to come in and say anything?
Well, I need to thank Peter. Yeah, that was absolutely fascinating. And the only reason our expert John Breeze hasn't joined in is he's even older than me and doesn't own a computer. But I missed a trick. I should have invited him round to my home and we could have sat here together.
And then you would have had a fed. You probably would have had to fed him and give him a beer or something. So
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's partly, Rod, why I was so keen to record it so that John can see it.
Yes.
But I'm sure others will want to see it too, and some will want to see it again. Sally, was there anything you wanted to say finally?
No, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating and really interesting.
And Nigel, I'm just referring to those people who'd actually asked questions or others. Nigel?
No, that's fine, thank you, Harold.
Well, Peter, thank you very much. That's been splendid. As soon as I've got it up on the website, I'll send you the link so that you've got it as well.
yeah, please do.
Rod, I probably won't do it until early next week. I'm absolutely over my head at the moment, but I will get it done. And as soon as I have, I'll get it out to everybody.
Great.
Peter, thank you very much indeed.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks. All right. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.